didn't knock. Roderick Whitcomb kicked open the door of the boarding house like he owned every plank of wood in it, because in his mind, he owned everything that had ever touched his family's name. He stood in the doorway, with his coat buttoned, clean, and his hat tilted just right, the kind of man who spent money on looking respectable, so nobody would look too closely at what was underneath. "Where is she?" Lenora Pike didn't move from behind the front desk. Her hands stayed flat on the counter, but her knuckles went white. "There is no one here by that name," she said. Roderick smiled. Didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Ma'am," he said, soft as poison, "I have legal documents. I have a signed agreement, and I have all the patience in the world." He looked around the room the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him. She can come out on her own, or this becomes a matter for the sheriff. He paused. "Either way, I always collect what's mine. If you were standing in that hallway, listening through a crack in the floorboards, what would you have done? Would you have walked out? Or would the fear have kept you exactly where you were pressed against the wall today, barely breathing, wondering how a man like that ever got the law on his side? That is the question Elara Whitcomb lived inside every single day. And this story is about the moment she finally found her answer. Before we go any further, if you're new here, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one, stories about ordinary people, surviving extraordinary cruelty, and finding their way back to themselves, are what we tell here every single week. Hit that like button. Leave a comment below with the city and country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach that pulled into Ironwood Crossing on the third Tuesday of April in 1881 was running 2 hours late and short one-wheel bolt that the driver had replaced with a piece of wire somewhere outside of Caldwell. It rattled into the main street like something that had barely survived the journey, which, as it turned out, was exactly how the woman inside it felt. Elara Whitcomb was 24 years old. She didn't look it. She looked like someone who had been 24 for a very long time, like the years had piled on top of each other without actually passing. Her hair was dark and pinned back tight, not because she cared much about how she looked, but because loose things made her nervous. She had learned in the years before that anything left loose could be grabbed. She had one trunk, brown leather, one broken clasp held shut with a leather cord she'd tied herself. Inside were 3 dresses, a wool blanket, a small tin box, and a stack of folded letters wrapped in oilcloth. Those letters she had packed first, before anything else. If the trunk had caught fire on the road, those were the only things she would have tried to save. She did not know a single person in Ironwood Crossing. That was precisely why she had come. The town was not impressive. Main Street was a single corridor of storefronts, a church without a steeple, a livery stable, a boarding house, a general store, and a blacksmith's forge that sent up a thin column of smoke even at that early hour. There were maybe 300 people in Ironwood Crossing, maybe fewer. Most of them had never been to Missouri and never planned to go. Nobody here would have heard the Whitcomb name. Nobody here would look at her and already think they knew who she was. She had chosen it on a map, pointing to the smallest town she could find in a county with no railroad connection. Hard to get to, easy to disappear into. She climbed down from the stagecoach carefully, trunk handle in both hands, and stood in the middle of the street while the driver unloaded other bags, and the town went about its business around her. A dog crossed the street in front of her. 2 men argued on the steps of the general store about the price of feed. A woman in a yellow apron swept her porch without looking up. Nobody paid Elara any attention. For exactly 30 seconds, she felt almost safe. Then a man selling newspapers from a crate on the corner called out, "Hey there, you just arrived? Welcome to Ironwood." And the whole sentence hit her like a hand on the shoulder she hadn't expected. Her throat closed. The greeting was nothing. Any person would have smiled, waved, maybe said thank you. Elara stood there with her mouth slightly open and said nothing at all. And the newspaper man blinked once, shrugged, and went back to calling out the headlines. She was already failing. She picked up her trunk and walked toward the boarding house before anyone else could speak to her. Her aunt, Lenora Pike, was not what Elara had expected from the letters they'd exchanged. She had imagined her mother's older sister as soft and accommodating, the way people sometimes become after they've been alone long enough. What she found instead was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 51 who shook Elara's hand like a man making a business agreement. "You're thinner than your mother was at your age," Lenora said, looking her over once. "I've been traveling," Elara said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. It usually did. Lenora looked at her another moment, then nodded as if she'd decided something. "Rooms on the second floor, end of the hall. Breakfast is at 6, supper at 7. If you want a bath, there's a barrel in the back, and you heat your own water." She picked up Elara's trunk with surprising ease and started for the stairs. "Any questions?" There were approximately 40 questions. Elara said nothing. "Didn't think so," Lenora said, already halfway up the stairs. The room was small, one window facing the street. A bed with a quilt that had been washed so many times the pattern had almost disappeared. A washstand, a hook on the back of the door. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, with her tin box in her lap, for a long time after Lenora left. She was not what you'd call all right. She hadn't been all right in a long time. But she was here. She had gotten herself here, and no one in this town knew her name or her history, or what had happened to her in the 4 years she'd spent in that house in Missouri, with a man who smiled at other people the same way since. Roderick smiled. A door swinging open before it slammed shut. She pressed her hand flat against the tin box and breathed. She was here. That had to be enough for now. The first week in Ironwood Crossing nearly broke her. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing happened to her. No one was cruel. Not exactly. It was subtler than that, and subtler things had always cut deeper. She needed to buy soap. Simple. She rehearsed it on the way to the general store. 2 blocks from the boarding house. "I'd like a bar of soap, please." "Just one, thank you." 6 words. She could do 6 words. Stood outside the store for 11 minutes. A woman came out with a child on her hip, looked at Elara standing on the step, and said, "You going in or out, honey?" Elara stepped aside without answering. She came back the next morning at 7, before most people were up, and bought the soap from old Mr. Hatch, who was half-deaf and didn't notice that she'd spoken barely above a whisper. She exhaled all the way home and sat down at the breakfast table with shaking hands that she hid under the tabletop. Lenora set a plate in front of her and said nothing, but she poured Elara's coffee before anyone else at the table got theirs. Small thing. But Elara noticed every small thing. The town, meanwhile, was noticing her. She could feel it, the way you feel a room shift when someone walks in who doesn't quite fit. By the end of the first week, she had been called that quiet woman at Lenora's, the new one who won't talk, and, from at least one source, Elara suspected was Corinne Vale. Peculiar. She heard that one through the wall of the general store while pretending to examine a bolt of cloth. Peculiar. Said in the tone of voice that was really saying something worse. Put the cloth down. She left without buying anything. She walked back to Lenora's with her eyes straight ahead and sat in her room, and pressed her palms flat against her knees until they stopped shaking. She didn't cry. She'd spent a long time learning not to cry, where anyone might hear her. The forge was directly across from the boarding house. She had noticed it, of course. It was hard not to notice. The sound of the hammer started just after sunrise, a steady, methodical rhythm that was nothing like noise and everything like a clock. It didn't startle her. It didn't change pitch unpredictably. It was simply there, consistent, every morning. Silas Mercer she had seen from a distance, tall, broad through the shoulders, in the way men get from actual work rather than intention. Dark hair going gray at the temples, maybe 30, maybe older. He moved with a kind of deliberate economy, no wasted motion, like a man who'd long ago decided that doing things right the first time was easier than doing them twice. She hadn't spoken to him. She hadn't intended to speak to him. But on the 8th morning, when she came downstairs earlier than usual, after a night that had given her maybe 3 hours of sleep, she found the front door of Lenora's already unlocked. She stepped out into the cool spring air and stopped. There was a wooden bench outside the blacksmith's forge. Old, worn, smooth. She'd seen it before, but never really looked at it. Silas had dragged it out from under the eave sometime in the morning and set it a few feet from the forge entrance. where the heat just barely reached. He was already working, back half turned, hammer going. There was a tin cup on the bench, and a second one on the ground beside it, turned upside down. She stood on the step of the boarding house for a long moment. Then she crossed the street. She picked up the cup on the ground. It was clean, recently rinsed. She stood there holding it, looking at the back of Silas's head, and he said, without stopping or turning around, "Coffee's in the pot on the stand. Help yourself." He didn't look at her. He didn't say anything else. He just went on working. She poured herself coffee. She sat down on the bench. She put both hands around the cup. The warmth came through the tin, and she stared at the forge and listened to the hammer and drank her coffee in silence. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, her throat didn't tighten. She stayed for 40 minutes. When she stood to go, she said, "Thank you." 2 words, barely audible. Silas didn't turn around, but he nodded once, the way you nod when something is understood. She went back across the street and up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she didn't understand what had just happened to her, only that something had shifted, just slightly, like a stone moved enough to let water find a new path. Came back the next morning, and the one after that. They didn't talk, not at first. Silas seemed to understand without being told that quiet was not something to fill up. He'd hammer and work, and occasionally comment on something. In the street below, a horse, he thought, was going lame, a cloud formation that suggested rain, not questions, not prompts, just observations released into the air and allowed to land wherever they wanted. She started listening for things to comment on herself. It took her almost 2 weeks to manage it. But one morning when a cat crossed the street with something dead in its mouth and deposited it proudly on Mr. Hatch's store step, Elara said, without thinking, "That cat knows exactly what it's doing." There was a pause in the hammering. Silas looked over at the cat, then back at his work. "That cat," he said, "has been leaving Hatch presents for 3 years. He doesn't know whether to be flattered or horrified." Elara almost smiled. It surprised her enough that she pressed her hand to her mouth. It was the most she had spoken to anyone in Ironwood Crossing in 2.5 weeks, and it had been about a cat with a dead bird. And somehow, that felt exactly right. Corinne Vale noticed before anyone else did. She would have noticed eventually regardless. Corinne was the kind of woman who was always watching Silas, which meant she was watching everything around him as a matter of course. She was 26. Auburn-haired, with a confidence that came partly from her father's money and partly from the fact that she had never been told no by anyone she considered important. Silas had never courted her. He had never said anything unkind to her either, which she had long since translated into not yet rather than not ever. The town understood at a certain level that Corinne Vale expected Silas Mercer to come to his senses eventually. Silas, for his part, appeared to be unaware of this expectation entirely, which was a kind of cruelty Corinne found both infuriating and irresistible. Then the quiet woman from Lenora's started sitting on his bench every morning. "She's over there again." Corinne mentioned to her friend Agnes Pryor one morning while they were outside the milliner's shop. She said it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather. Agnes glanced across the street. "She doesn't talk much." "She doesn't talk at all," Corinne said. "You know what that usually means." Agnes didn't ask what it meant. She'd learned that Corinne didn't usually need to be prompted. "People who don't talk are usually hiding something," Corinne said. "Or they think they're better than the rest of us and don't want to waste their breath." She watched Elara turn her coffee cup in both hands. "Either way, I don't trust it." She said this with the authority of someone delivering a verdict, and by supper time that evening, the verdict had made its way around town in the way things always do in small places, quietly and thoroughly, until everyone had an opinion about the woman who didn't speak and what it probably meant. Elara didn't know any of this. She was in her room with her tin box open, going through the letters for the 4th time that week, checking that they were all still there, still intact, the dates visible, the signatures clear. She went through them slowly, one by one, and then put them back and closed the box and locked it and sat with it in her lap until her heartbeat slowed. They were still there. As long as those letters were there, she had not lost everything. The morning she first learned someone had been asking questions about her started like every other morning. Silas had his back to the street, working on a set of hinges for the livery stable. Elara had her coffee. The hammer was going. Then Silas stopped. He set the hammer down with a deliberateness that was different from his usual rhythm and turned around, which he almost never did in the middle of working. He stood in the entrance of the forge, looking down the main street with his hands loose at his sides. Elara followed his gaze. A man she didn't recognize was standing outside the boarding house. He was speaking to Mr. Hatch's boy, who did occasional errands for Lenora. The man was tall, lean in a way that looked hungry rather than healthy, with a hat pulled low enough that you couldn't quite get a read on his face. He was gesturing, asking something. The boy shook his head twice and pointed, briefly, in the direction of the boarding house. The man looked at the boarding house. Then, for just a moment, he looked across the street. His gaze moved over the forge, over the bench, and landed for 1/2 second on Elara. She didn't know his face, but she felt it, the way you feel the temperature drop before the wind changes. Something animal and old and deeply practiced, a recognition that she had spent years trying to unlearn, rose up through her chest like cold water. She stood up, her cup tilted off the bench and hit the ground. She didn't hear it, Elara. Silas's voice was quiet. Not alarmed, just steady. She was already moving. Across the street, up the step, through the front door of the boarding house, before the man with the low hat had taken 3 steps in her direction. She went straight up the stairs without speaking to Lenora, straight to her room, and she turned the lock on the door and pressed her back against it and stood there in the middle of the afternoon, with both hands flat on the wood behind her. Her breathing was loud in the small room. She could hear nothing from the street. She crossed to the window, stood to one side of it, just far enough back that she could see out without being easily seen. The man was still there, talking to someone else now. He was gesturing with his hands in a way that looked casual, but wasn't. She had never seen him before in her life, but she knew exactly who had sent him. She stayed at the window for a long time, watching, until Lenora knocked on her door and said, through the wood, in a voice that was careful and even, Elara, there's supper downstairs, when you're ready. Elara did not move from the window. She was not ready. She was not sure she would ever be ready for what was coming. Because Roderick Whitcomb did not send men to towns he wasn't planning to visit himself. He sent them first, so that by the time he arrived, the story was already told, and the story never included his name on the wrong side of things. She pressed her fingernails into the windowsill until she felt the wood beneath them. She had run far enough. She knew that now. The only question left was whether running was still an option, or whether she had finally reached the place where she would have to stop. Stand. Speak. She pressed her forehead against the glass and looked at the bench across the street, empty now, the tin cup still on its side in the dirt where she had dropped it. She had not come all this way to lose, but she had not yet figured out how to win. That part, she was still going to have to find inside herself, and she wasn't sure it was there. She didn't come down for supper that night. Lenora brought a plate up anyway, knocked once, set it on the floor outside the door, and didn't say a word about it. That was Lenora's way. She didn't press. She didn't ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. It was a quality Elara had come to appreciate more than she knew how to say, which was fitting, since she couldn't say much of anything to begin with. Elara heard the plate being set down. She heard her aunt's footsteps going back down the hall. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame and her tin box in her lap, and she listened to the boarding house settle around her, the creak of other guests moving through their rooms, the distant sound of someone laughing downstairs, a horse going past on the street outside. Normal sounds, safe sounds. She told herself she was being foolish. One strange man asking questions did not mean the end of everything. People asked questions in small towns all the time. Travelers came through. Strangers passed. It didn't have to mean anything. But she had opened that tin box 3 times in the last hour, and each time she counted the letters the same way, one by one, touching each page like she was taking attendance. They were all there, all of them. The correspondence between Roderick and his lawyers, with dates that contradicted the story he told about the property agreement. The original deed records 3 letters in Elara's own hand, sent before her husband died, that established clearly what she had and had not agreed to sign. Evidence Proof, the kind of thing that should have settled the matter before it ever started. The kind of thing Roderick Whitcomb had been trying to take from her for 2 years. She locked the box, tucked it under the loose board beneath her washstand, and finally opened the door to retrieve the plate her aunt had left. Food was cold. She ate it anyway, standing in the doorway, because she hadn't eaten since morning, and her hands were starting to shake in the particular way they did when her body reminded her it still had needs, regardless of what her mind was doing. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep. By 5 in the morning, she gave up pretending and went downstairs. Lenora was already in the kitchen, which didn't surprise her. Lenora always seemed to have been awake for hours before anyone else appeared, as if she conducted the most important part of her day in private, and the rest of it was simply the performance for other people. Without looking up from the stove, Elara sat. Her aunt put coffee in front of her, then turned back to whatever she was doing with the cast-iron skillet, and for several minutes, neither of them said anything. Kitchen was warm. The window above the sink was starting to show the first gray suggestion of morning. "There was a man yesterday," Elara finally said, "outside, asking questions." "I know," Lenora said. "Hatch told me." Elara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Did you talk to him?" "He didn't come in here." Lenora's voice was even, but there was something careful in it. "He was asking around outside, asking if there was a woman staying here who'd come from Missouri. Dark hair, traveling alone." Coffee cup was warm against Elara's palms. She focused on that. "What did people say?" Lenora turned around. She looked at her niece with those sharp eyes that missed nothing and revealed very little. "What do you think they said?" "People in this town don't know you from a fence post. Half of them think you're peculiar. The other half haven't made up their minds yet." She paused. "Nobody told him anything useful. Partly because they don't know anything useful, and partly because a stranger asking pointed questions about a woman tends to make people in a place like this go quiet." Elara exhaled. "He'll be back, probably, and whoever sent him will come after." Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from Elara and sat down, which she almost never did during morning prep, and that alone told Elara this was a different kind of conversation. "Elara," she said the name plainly, without softness, but not unkindly. "I am your mother's sister. I don't know what happened to you in Missouri, and I'm not going to ask you right now, because right now doesn't seem like the time. But I need to know one thing." She looked straight at her. "Are you in danger?" Elara looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the ring from her coffee cup. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. She didn't know if Roderick would come himself. She didn't know if the man outside was a hired inquiry agent or something worse. She didn't know how much Roderick knew about where she was or how long she'd been here. What she knew was that 2 years was a long time to stay ahead of a man who had money and patience, and absolutely no intention of letting her keep what was rightfully hers. "All right," Lenora said. She'd stood back up like the conversation had reached a natural stopping point and went back to her skillet. "Eat your breakfast when it's ready. We'll figure it out." "We," such a small word. Elara felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. She crossed the street to the forge that morning later than usual, nearly 7, when the sun was already over the roofline and Silas had been working for at least an hour. Almost at the bench when he spoke without turning. "Dropped your cup yesterday." She looked at the ground. Tin cup was back on the bench, clean, right side up. She sat down, sipped her coffee from the pot on the stand. She held the cup with both hands and said nothing for a while, and the hammer went on doing what the hammer did, steady and known. After a few minutes, Silas stopped. He set the tongs down and turned around, which he did less often than she'd gotten used to, and he looked at her directly. "That man who was outside Lenora's yesterday," he said. "You know him?" "No, but you know who sent him." It wasn't a question. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular expression he had, the one that didn't require anything from her, that simply waited. He nodded once, turned back to the forge. "All right," he said, and picked up the tongs again. "And that was it. That was all," he said. No follow-up, no questions about who or why or what it meant. He had asked what he needed to know and accepted what she'd given him and moved on. And Elara sat there on that worn bench and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately remember. She felt like her answer had been enough, like she had been enough. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the street and breathed through her nose and absolutely did not cry. Because she was not going to cry on this bench, across from this man she barely knew, over something as small as being asked a question and then let alone to answer it at her own pace. She was not going to do that. She didn't do that. But it was closer than she would have liked. Harlan Voss came back on a Thursday. She saw him from her window first. Same hat, same lean frame, standing outside the livery stable, this time, and talking to one of the stable hands. She watched him for 10 minutes. He wasn't hiding. That was the thing that frightened her more than if he'd been sneaking around. He was walking openly through the town, asking questions like a man who had every right to be there, who had nothing to conceal and nothing to apologize for. That was Roderick's style. Roderick never skulked. He always walked in the front door, smiled at everyone, shook hands, bought drinks, and let the situation rearrange itself around him before anyone realized it was happening. She had lived inside that strategy for 4 years. She knew exactly how it worked. She knew what came next. She went downstairs. She sat in Lenora's small front parlor, where she could see the street through the window without being seen herself, and she watched Harlan Voss work his way methodically down the main street. Stopped at the general store, went in, came out after 10 minutes. He stopped at the barber's, shorter this time. He crossed toward the boarding house. Elara stood up. "Lenora," she said, and she was surprised by how clear her voice came out, how little it shook. "There's a man coming to the door." Lenora appeared from the back hallway, drying her hands on her apron, and looked at her niece with an expression that was already settling into something firm. "Go upstairs," Lenora said. Go upstairs, Elara." She said it the way a woman says something when she has already made her decision and is simply informing the other parties. "We'll handle the door." Elara went upstairs. She sat on the top step, just around the corner from the landing, where she could hear but not be seen, and she listened. The knock came 2 minutes later, 3 solid raps. She heard the door open, heard Lenora's voice, pleasant and absolutely impenetrable. "Good morning." "Morning, ma'am." Voss's voice was smoother than she'd expected. "Practiced. I'm looking for a woman by the name of Whitcomb. Elara Whitcomb. I was told she might be boarding here." There was a pause just long enough to be thoughtful, without being suspicious. "I'm afraid I don't recognize that name," Lenora said. "She would have arrived maybe 3-4 weeks ago. Dark hair, traveling alone. Younger woman. We get a lot of travelers through here," Lenora said, with the easy tone of a woman who genuinely believed what she was saying. "Couldn't speak to every guest we've had." Another pause. "I understand," Voss said, and he sounded like he did understand, like he understood quite a bit. "If someone fitting that description does come through, I'd appreciate a word. I'm acting on behalf of her family. They're concerned about her." "Well, that's very kind," Lenora said. "I'll keep it in mind." The door closed. Elara sat on the top step and pressed both hands flat against her thighs until she heard Lenora's footsteps come back down the hall and start up the stairs. Aunt appeared at the bottom of the landing and looked up at her. "He's not with any family," Elara said. It came out barely above a whisper. "No," Lenora agreed. "He isn't," she told Silas that evening. Not everything. Not the whole story. Not yet. But she told him that the man who'd come asking was employed by someone who wanted something from her that she did not intend to give. She said it sitting on the bench after supper, when the main street had quieted, and the forge had cooled, and the light was going long and gold across the dirt road. Silas sat beside her. He'd brought his own cup out, which he almost never did, and he was turning it slowly in his hands without drinking from it. "How far back does this go?" he asked. 4 years, she said. "Maybe longer. My husband died 2 years ago." She stopped, started again. "His brother claimed that before he died, my husband signed the property over, that I'd agreed to it, signed my own name to documents giving up my inheritance." Silas was quiet. "You didn't sign them," he said. "Not a question." "I never saw them until after Thomas was buried," she said. "Roderick produced them at the reading of the will in front of lawyers and a notary and everyone who mattered in that county, and they looked right. The date was right. The signatures looked right." She looked at her hands. "But I have letters from before Thomas died and before that show what I had agreed to and what I hadn't. And I have other documents, Things that should be enough to show a judge what really happened. Then why haven't you gone to a judge? She turned the cup. Because Roderick knows every judge in 3 counties, she said. And I had no one to go with me, and no one who would believe me. And every time I tried to speak about it, the room went quiet in a way that told me the decision had already been made. She stopped. I was his brother's wife, a widow. I had no family near. I had no. She took a breath. I didn't have anyone. Silas said nothing for a moment. You have the documents with you now? He asked. Yes. Safe? Yes, he nodded. Drank from his cup finally. Then you still have ground to stand on, he said. As long as you have those, he hasn't taken everything. It was such a plain, practical thing to say. No promises. No reassurances that it would all work out. Just, you have the evidence. Therefore, you are not without options. Kind of thing a person says when they're taking a situation seriously, rather than trying to make you feel better about it. She had not heard anyone take her situation seriously in 2 years. She had to look away again, at the road, at the darkening sky. He'll come himself, she said. Voss is just the advance. Roderick always sends someone ahead. She searched for the word. To arrange things, so that by the time he gets there, people have already heard one version of the story. Silas was quiet for a moment. What version does he tell? That I'm confused, she said. That I'm fragile. That grief does things to women, makes them unreliable, makes them misremember what they agreed to. That I stole documents from the estate and fled because I knew I was wrong. She said it flatly, without emphasis, the way you say something you've heard. So many times it's lost the ability to hurt you directly and just sits there like a stone. He says it very gently, with great concern for my well-being. And people believe it. People believe what sounds reasonable, she said. And a grieving widow who ran away sounds less reasonable than a respectable man with papers and lawyers. Silas looked at the street for a long moment. Then he said, You've been running since you got here. It wasn't an accusation, but it landed like one. She didn't answer. He wasn't wrong. He's going to come, Silas said. You said so yourself, which means at some point you're going to have to stop running and make him prove what he's claiming. He paused. Those letters you have, would a circuit judge accept them? If I can get in front of one before Roderick poisons the well. There's a judge due through here in about 3 weeks, Silas said. Judge Calloway. He comes through every 2 months. Mostly property disputes and cattle claims. He turned to look at her. Would that be enough time? She looked at him. How do you know about the circuit schedule? I've lived here 12 years, he said. I know when the judge comes. I know when the mail comes. I know which families owe each other money and which horses are getting too old for work, he shrugged, without apology. Small town, she almost smiled. 3 weeks, she said. Give or take. She thought about Voss, still somewhere in town, still asking questions. She thought about Roderick, back in Missouri or already on the road west, patient and methodical, so certain she would fold before he had to do much of anything. He had always been certain of that, from the very first time she'd tried to argue, and he'd smiled at her with that smile and said, Elara, you know you're not good with this sort of thing. And she had, in that moment, believed him, pressed her fingernail into the side of the tin cup. She did not believe him anymore, but she was not yet sure what she believed instead. The week that followed was the strangest she had spent in Ironwood Crossing, which was saying something that none of the weeks before it had been easy. Voss stayed. He didn't approach the boarding house again. He seemed to understand that Lenora was not going to give him anything useful, and so he redirected his attention to the rest of the town, to the less guarded conversations. Talk at the saloon and the grain exchange and the space outside the livery where men stood around, waiting for horses, and had nothing to do but talk. Elara could feel it happening. She could feel the shape of it in the way. Conversations shifted slightly when she entered the general store. The way a silence would reorganize itself and resume on a different subject when she passed by a group of women on the boardwalk. Small signs, nothing she could point to directly, but she knew them. She had grown up reading small signs, the way people who live in uncertain houses learn to read weather. Corinne Vale had apparently told Agnes Pryor, and Agnes had told someone else, and Agnes had told someone else that the stranger was looking for Lenora's new boarder because of some business with a deceased husband's estate. And the word estate in a story involving a young widow and a persistent stranger had a way of implying things without saying them outright. Had she been cheated? Had she done the cheating? Was she running from something she'd done or something done to her? Nobody knew. That was exactly the problem. Nobody knew, and Corinne, to her credit, hadn't said Elara was guilty of anything, but she'd said enough about mystery and disappeared husbands and documents in dispute that the town was drawing its own conclusions, and the conclusions were not particularly charitable. Elara knew this because Lenora told her, directly, without softening it. "You need to start showing your face more," Lenora said one evening. "Not because you owe anyone an explanation, but because people fill in silence with whatever fits their mood. Right now, the story they're filling in isn't helping you." Elara turned her fork over on the table. "I know," she said. "So I'm trying." She looked up. "It's not I'm not." She stopped, getting better at sentences slowly, but some of them still backed up behind other sentences and created a traffic of words that came out wrong or didn't come out at all. Lenora waited. "When I try to talk to people I don't know," Elara said carefully, "my throat closes. Been that way for a long time. It's not because I don't want to. It's not because I think I'm better than anyone. It's just," she pressed her hand flat on the table. "Just does." Lenora looked at her for a moment. "Since Thomas?" Elara considered that. "Since before. Since living in that house made me understand that anything I said could be used to show I was wrong, or confused, or ungrateful, or making too much of something. She said it without drama. Stopped saying things. It was easier." Lenora was quiet for a long beat. Long enough that Elara wondered if she'd said too much. "Your mother was the same way," Lenora said finally. Elara looked up, not with men, but with situations. Rooms where people expected something from her. Lenora picked up her own fork. She had to learn too. Took her a long time. But she did. It was the most her aunt had ever said about her mother who had been dead for 6 years. Elara sat with it for a moment. This small accidental gift dropped into the middle of supper and tried to understand what to do with it. "I'll try," she said, "to go out more." "I know you will," Lenora said, and went back to eating, and that was the end of it. She tried. She made herself walk through town the next afternoon at the time of day when the most people were out. She went to the general store without rehearsing at the door. She nodded at the women by the milliners, even though her neck felt like it was made of wood. She bought a spool of thread she didn't need from Mr. Hatch and managed to say thank you in a voice that was at least audible. Small things, barely anything. But she came back to the boarding house without having run from anyone, and she sat on her bed, and her hands weren't shaking, and that felt like something. The next day she did it again, and the day after, and one afternoon, Silas fell into step beside her on her way back from the store, which surprised her enough that she nearly stumbled, and he said nothing about it, simply walked alongside her at the same pace until they reached the front of Lenora's, and then stopped and said, "Getting easier?" She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Good," he said, and turned back toward the forge. She watched him go. She thought about asking him something she was not sure what, only that there was a question forming somewhere inside her that she hadn't quite assembled into words yet. Something about why he kept doing this, not in a suspicious way, just in the genuine, confused way of someone who had been given so few things for no reason that she kept expecting the reason to appear. She didn't ask. Not yet. She went inside, but the question stayed with her. Roderick Whitcomb arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, the 3rd week of May. Elara was sitting on the bench when his hired coach came up the main street, because of course he had a hired coach. Roderick did not arrive on the public stagecoach. He did not take a seat between strangers with their luggage and their noise. He arrived in a private vehicle, well-maintained, with a driver in a clean coat, who pulled up directly in front of the Silver Horn Hotel, the best accommodation in Ironwood Crossing, which was not saying much, with the kind of practiced unhurry that said money without having to announce it. She saw him before he saw her. He looked exactly the same. That was one of the things about Roderick. He didn't look like a villain. He didn't look like anything you'd want to cross the street to avoid. He was 50, well-dressed, with a full gray beard trimmed close, and the kind of weathered gentleman appearance that read as trustworthy to people who hadn't watched him work. He stepped down from the coach, handed something to the driver, and looked up and down the main street of Ironwood Crossing with the easy confidence of a man who had just bought a town he hadn't visited yet. His eyes traveled the street, passed over the forge, passed over the bench, settled on her. She did not move. She did not run. She didn't know afterward if that was bravery or simply the paralysis of a body that had run out of directions to go. She sat perfectly still on that bench, with her coffee cup cold in her hands, and looked back at him. Roderick Whitcomb smiled, not warmly, not in a way that meant anything good. It was the smile he wore when he understood that the process was working the way he'd intended. Touched the brim of his hat, almost a greeting, almost mocking. Then he turned and walked into the hotel. Elara set her cup down on the bench. Both her hands were shaking. Not from fear. Or not only from fear, there was something else in there, something hot and unwilling, something that had been living under the fear for a long time and was tired of being covered by it. Silas appeared in the entrance of the forge. He had seen it too. He looked at her. She looked at him. "That's him," she said. Her voice was steady. She hadn't expected that. Silas said nothing for a moment. "Then, how long have you had those letters?" 2 years. "And you've been carrying them alone for 2 years." He was quiet for another beat, looking at the hotel where Roderick had disappeared, and then he looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between anger on her behalf and the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what he thinks and is not going to be talked out of it. "You're not carrying them alone anymore," he said. She almost said, "You don't have to do that." The words were already forming. The old reflex, the one that had been trained into her by years of learning that needing things from people was a liability. She almost said it. She didn't. Instead, she nodded once, small. And Silas nodded back and went into the forge and picked up his hammer. And the rhythm started again, steady and known, the same sound that had been the first thing in Ironwood Crossing that hadn't made her flinch. She sat on the bench and listened to it. Roderick was here. He would start his work tonight, at the hotel bar, over drinks, with handshakes and that particular brand of confidence that made people want to believe him without knowing why. By morning, he would have a version of the story installed in enough heads to make any other version sound like the ravings of a confused woman who had never quite got over her grief. She knew how he worked. She had 3 weeks to judge Calloway's circuit. She had her letters. She had Lenora. And she had Silas, who had just said, "You're not carrying them alone anymore," in the plainest, least remarkable voice imaginable, like it was simply the truth and not the most significant thing anyone had said to her in 4 years. She was not all right. She was frightened in a way that went all the way down to the bottom of her. She did not have a plan. She did not have powerful friends or a lawyer or anything that could match what Roderick Whitcomb brought into a room when he walked into it. But she was still on the bench. She had not run. And for the first time since the stagecoach had rattled her into Ironwood Crossing on a Tuesday morning in April, that felt like it might be enough to start with. The hammer struck iron across the street, even, reliable, present. She picked up her cold coffee and drank the last of it, and she sat there in the morning light with Roderick Whitcomb on the same street as her for the first time in 2 years, and she made herself breathe. And she stayed. Roderick Whitcomb did not waste a single evening. By the time Elara had gone upstairs that night, changed out of her dress, and pressed her back against the headboard, with her tin box in her lap, he was already at the Silver Horn's small bar, buying rounds for men he'd never met, laughing at jokes he'd heard the punchline of before they were finished. She knew this not because she saw it, but because she knew him, knew the sequence of it, the way you know the pattern of a storm that has already hit you once. First the drinks, then the easy questions about the town, about the people, about who was who and what mattered here. Then, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th round, the casual mention of a family matter that had brought him all this way, and wasn't it a shame what grief did to some women? And he didn't blame her. Not really, but the documents were the documents, and the law was the law. She sat with the tin box and stared at the ceiling. She could not stop him from talking. She had never been able to stop him from talking. Roderick Whitcomb's greatest weapon had always been his voice, the way it moved through a room like something warm and reasonable, something you wanted to believe, because believing it was easier than doubting it. She had watched him do it in Missouri parlors and county courtrooms, and at her husband's about saying kind things about Thomas, while simultaneously beginning the legal process of taking everything Thomas had left behind. She had spent 2 years being unable to answer that voice, but she was going to have to find a way. She pressed her thumb against the latch of the tin box, opened it, counted the letters again, knowing they hadn't gone anywhere, needing to count them anyway. All there, she closed it, locked it, put it under the board. She was not going to sleep, but she turned the lamp down anyway and lay in the dark and made herself breathe slowly, the way she'd learned to breathe in the years when she'd shared a house with a man who read anxiety as weakness and weakness as permission to push harder. She had gotten very good at making herself look still on the outside while everything underneath ran fast and cold. 12 days to Judge Calloway. She counted them like stones in her pocket and tried to sleep. Morning came gray and humid, the kind of May morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to be spring or summer, and settled on neither. She was on the bench by 6 earlier than usual, because she had been awake since 4, and lying in bed had stopped feeling like rest and started feeling like waiting. Silas was already at the forge. Of course he was. He set the second cup out, without comment, the way he always did, and she poured her coffee, and sat and listened to the hammer and let the rhythm of it work on her the way it always did, settling something in her chest that woke up anxious and needed the regularity of something dependable to slow down again. After about 20 minutes he stopped it, aimed straight, and came to stand in the entrance of the forge, not just standing with his arms crossed and looking at the street. He was at the Silver Horn last night, Silas said. I know, talking to Len Grafton and the Whitmore brothers. He paused. And Corinne's father. Elara looked at him. Martin Vale, Silas said. He owns the livery and about a third of the grazing land north of town. People listened to him. She felt the familiar coldness move through her. Of course, Roderick had found the right men to talk to within 12 hours of arriving. He always did. He had a sense for power in a room, the way some animals had a sense for weather. What was he saying? I wasn't in there, Silas said. But Boyd Hatch, old Hatch's nephew, tends bar some nights. He mentioned it this morning when he brought his horse in. He looked at her, said there was a gentleman from Missouri, came to help settle a family inheritance matter. Said his late brother's widow had taken some documents that were meant for the estate. Took was not stolen, not yet. Took was the first word, the gentle one, the one that left room for confusion and error rather than malice. She knew the progression. Took would become misplaced, and misplaced would become withheld, and withheld would eventually become something else, depending on how the town received each step. Did anyone say anything about me directly? She asked. Silas hesitated. Grafton apparently asked if the widow was the quiet woman at Lenora's, he said. Roderick said he didn't know where she was staying. Said he hoped she was well, and that he harbored no ill feelings. It came out small and a little ragged. He's very good at that, I noticed, Silas said, in a tone that suggested he did not find it admirable. She turned her cup in her hands. He'll introduce himself to people as the day goes on. He'll be very pleasant. He'll find reasons to do business with people. Buy things he doesn't need, pay a little over asking price for them. By the end of the week, he'll have the town thinking he's the most reasonable man they've ever met. She paused. And then he'll start asking where I am. Silas came and sat down on the opposite end of the bench. He didn't do that often. He sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the street. You said the circuit judge comes in 12 days, he said. 11 now. Can you get a message out before then? To anyone outside this town who could verify what you've got? She had thought about this. She had been thinking about almost nothing else. There was a lawyer in Caldwell, she said. A woman named Beaumont who helped me get the copies made before I left Missouri. She knows what's in those letters. She saw the originals. She stopped. But even if I wrote to her today, I don't know if she'd get here in time. Or if she'd come, would she write something? An affidavit? Maybe, if she was willing to put herself in Roderick's sights. She looked at her lap. That's a lot to ask of someone. It is, Silas said. But it's worth asking. She nodded slowly. It was worth asking. She had been so long in the habit, of not asking for things from people, not expecting them to do something that would cost them, not wanting to be the kind of burden that asked for more and could comfortably be given, that the idea of writing Dombom and saying, "I need you to do something hard for me," sat oddly in her chest. But she would do it. She would write the letter today. "There's something else," Silas said. She looked at him. "You should talk to people," he said. "Not about Roderick. Not about the inheritance. Just," he seemed to search for the right way to say it, "talk to people. The storekeeper. The women at the milliner's. Anyone who'll give you a normal conversation." He looked at her steadily. "You've been here 2 months, and most of this town still sees a mystery when they see you. A mystery's easy to fill in once someone, like Roderick, starts providing answers." She knew he was right. She had known it since Lenora said nearly the same thing a week ago. Knowing it and being able to do it were 2 different countries. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He said, "I'm not trying to make it sound simple." "No," she said quietly. "You're not." He stood up, went back inside. The hammer started again. She drank her cold coffee and thought about how a woman who couldn't reliably order soap without rehearsing it 4 times was supposed to go out into a street where her enemy was already charming everyone she knew and simply become someone the town trusted more than they trusted him. She did not know how to do that, but she was going to have to figure it out in 11 days, so she supposed she had better start. She wrote to Beaumont that morning. 4 pages, careful and clear, laying out what she had, what she needed, and what the timeline looked like. She sealed the letter and gave it to the mail rider herself rather than leave it at the front desk. Standing at the edge of the road with the envelope in her hand and a feeling in her stomach like the moment before jumping across something you weren't sure you could clear, she watched the rider go. Then she turned around and walked to the general store. Mr. Hatch was behind the counter, as always. He was in his mid-60s, mostly deaf in his right ear, with the particular disinterested benevolence of a man who had been selling things to people for so long that he no longer had much curiosity about who they were or what they were doing with their purchases. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said without looking up from his ledger. She moved through the store slowly, taking things off shelves and putting them back, giving herself time. There was one other customer, a woman she recognized as Martha Caldwell, no relation, to the town, who was examining bolts of cloth at the far end of the store. Elara made her way to the cloth. Martha Caldwell looked up. She was maybe 40, with a practical face and flower on her sleeve that she hadn't noticed. "Morning," Martha said, in the tone of someone being polite without committing to a conversation. "Morning," Elara said. And then, because she had decided to try, because she had 11 days and couldn't afford to stay invisible anymore, "That blue one's nice. Good weight to it." Martha glanced at the cloth she'd been looking at. "You think so?" "For curtains," Elara said. Her throat was trying to do its thing, the closing up thing, and she talked through it. Thick enough it would actually block some light. Martha picked up the edge of the cloth and considered it with new attention. "I've got windows that let in too much morning sun," she said. "East-facing. Same problem in my room at Lenora's," Elara said. Martha looked at her then, a real look, the kind that noticed something. "You're Lenora's niece," she said. "Yes. You've been here a few months." "Since April," Elara said. "Elara Whitcomb." Martha nodded. "Martha Caldwell. My husband runs the feeds store on the East End." She paused. "Settling in all right?" It was such a normal question. Kind of question that passed between women in stores 100 times a day, easy and thoughtless and utterly ordinary. Elara had been unable to answer questions like that for so long that for a half-second she almost lost the thread of it. "Getting there," she said. "It's a good town." Martha seemed satisfied with that. "It is," she said. "Takes a while to find your footing, but it's a good town." She bought the blue cloth. Elara bought nothing, and that was fine. She walked back to Lenora's with her chin up and her hands only slightly unsteady, and she felt like she had run a mile, which she recognized was completely disproportionate to what had actually occurred, and she also didn't care. She had done it. She could do it again. Roderick introduced himself to the town in exactly the sequence Elara had predicted. By the second day, he had done business at the livery, the grain exchange, and the Silver Horn. By the third day, he had paid a courtesy call on the sheriff, A man named Aldous Crane, 50-ish. Fair-minded, in the way of someone who had dealt with enough land disputes to be careful about taking sides before all the facts were in, and presented himself as a businessman dealing with a private family matter. Crane came to see Lenora on the 4th day. Elara was in the kitchen when she heard the knock, and she heard Crane's voice through the door, and she stood very still and listened to Lenora say she'd be happy to speak with him. And please come in. She did not go out, but she stood in the kitchen doorway where she could hear without being visible. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," Crane said. He had a voice like someone who had learned to be reasonable by practice rather than temperament. "I had a conversation with a Mr. Whitcomb. He tells me he has a legal matter involving a woman who may be staying here." "She is staying here," Lenora said. "She's my niece." Pause. "I see," Crane said. Is she willing to speak with me?" Briefest silence, and then Lenora says, "I'll ask her." Elara stepped out of the kitchen before Lenora had to come and find her. She came into the front hallway, and Crane looked at her with the careful attention of a man trying to form an opinion without showing it. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "I'm Sheriff Crane." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Mr. Whitcomb says he has a legal claim to certain currently in your possession. He says they relate to your late husband's estate." "He would say that," Elara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He's been saying it for 2 years. Crane didn't react to that. "Do you have the documents he's referring to?" "I have correspondence and records relating to my own inheritance," she said. "Yes, he describes them differently." "I imagine he does," she said. "He's very good at describing things." Something moved in Crane's expression, not agreement, exactly, but a shift, a recognition that she was not what he'd perhaps been led to expect. Not fragile, not confused, not a woman barely managing her grief and her circumstances. "Is there a legal proceeding underway?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "I intend to present the documents to Judge Calloway when he comes through on his circuit. That's about 10 days. "Yes." Crane nodded slowly. "And between now and then, you're not going anywhere?" "No," she said, "I'm not." He looked at her steadily. Then he nodded again, in a way that settled something for him. "All right, Miss Whitcomb. That's all I needed to know." He touched his hat to Lenora. "Ma'am." He left. Lenora closed the door and turned around and looked at her niece. "Well," she said. "Well," Elara said. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Lenora said, "You spoke well," in the same tone she'd used to say. The cornbread had turned out right, factual, and without performance, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Elara stood in the hallway for another minute. She had spoken well. She pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. It was on the 6th day that Corinne Vale came to see her. Elara was on the bench when it happened. Silas was inside, working. It was late morning, warm enough that she'd left her shawl upstairs, and she was sitting with her coffee, thinking about nothing in particular, which had become a skill she was slowly relearning, the ability to let her mind be quiet without immediately filling down the silence with things to be afraid of. She heard the footsteps coming toward her and looked up. Corinne Vale at close range was more complicated than she'd seemed from a distance. She was striking, not pretty in a soft way, but in the way of someone who had a lot of presence and knew it. She was also, Elara noticed, wearing an expression that sat uneasily between what it wanted to be and what it was choosing to be. She stopped in front of the bench. "Miss Whitcomb," she said. Elara said nothing. She waited. Corinne seemed to be working through something. She stood straight with her hands at her sides and her chin up, but there was a tightness around her mouth that looked like a woman who had rehearsed a speech and now wasn't sure it was the right one. "Mr. Whitcomb came to my father's house last night," she said finally. "For supper." Elara kept her face still. "He told my father the same things he's been telling everyone," Corinne went on. "About the documents. About you." She paused. "He's very believable." "I know," Elara said. Corinne looked at her. "I've been saying things about you," she said. "Around town, since you arrived." Another pause, shorter this time. "Things I didn't actually know. She stopped. Started again. "I was making assumptions." Elara waited. "My father likes him," Corinne said, and something in her voice had changed, gone quieter. "He sat at our table and talked about family honor and legal obligations, and what's owed to the dead, and my father nodded along the whole time." She looked at Elara directly. "But he didn't once ask about you." about whether you were managing, about whether you'd been treated well. He talked about your husband, about the estate, about the documents, and he talked about them the way people talk about property. She pressed her lips together. Not about a person, about property. Something shifted in Elara's chest. Careful, she told herself. Careful. What are you saying, Miss Vale? Corinne held her gaze. I'm saying that a man who talks about his late brother's widow for an entire supper and never once uses her name is not a man who's concerned about doing right by her. Her jaw was tight. He called you the widow every time. Never, Elara. Never even Miss Whitcomb. Elara felt the cold moving through her that always came with hearing the truth stated plainly. That's what I've been to him since Thomas died, she said. Category, not a person. Corinne was quiet for a moment. He asked my father if he'd be willing to speak on his behalf before the circuit judge, she said, to affirm his character. My father said he'd think about it. That was the cold landing hard. She thought of Martin Vale, who owned the livery and a third of the North grazing land. Who people listened to. She thought of Roderick, calculating all of it from his hotel room. That's knowing exactly which man in which one town to sit across a supper table from. Did he say yes? Elara asked. Not yet. Corinne looked away down the street. My father is a good man. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He believed what he was told. She looked back. A lot of people in this town believed what they were told. About you, I mean. Before Roderick got here, I started some of that, she said it without flinching. I'm not proud of it. Elara considered her. She did not trust Corinne Vale. She had been given no particular reason to trust her, and she had learned in the years of her marriage that people's reasons for sudden kindness were not always what they appeared. But she had also learned to notice when someone was telling the truth as opposed to telling a story. And Corinne, standing in front of her in the morning sun, with her chin still up, but her eyes complicated, was telling the truth. Why are you telling me this? Elara asked. Because I sat at that table and watched him, and I thought Corinne stopped. I thought about what it would be like to be a woman with no one in the room who was on her side. She met Elara's eyes, and I thought that if someone had done to me what I suspect he did to you, I would want to know who at least wasn't against me. It was not a declaration of loyalty. It was not a promise of help. It was simply, I am not your enemy. Given everything, that was not nothing. Thank you, Elara said. Corinne nodded once. Then she said, I'll talk to my father. She said it quickly, like she'd made the decision right then and wanted to say it before she talked herself out of it. I don't know if he'll change his mind, but I'll talk to him. She turned and left before Elara could respond. Elara sat for a long time after that, turning her empty cup in her hands. From inside the forge, the hammer kept its steady beat. She heard Silas's voice without turning. What did she want? To tell me something she didn't have to tell me, Elara said. Pause in the rhythm. Good or bad? Silas asked. She thought about it. Both, I think. Mostly, she stopped. Mostly just honest. The hammer started again. On the 8th day, Roderick found her alone. She had known it would happen eventually. He was too deliberate to leave it to chance, but he was also too careful to do it in front of witnesses he hadn't already accounted for. She had been watching for it, watching him from windows and from the corner of her eye, measuring the distance between where she was and where he happened to be, and still he managed it. She was coming back from posting a second letter, a follow-up to Beaumont, shorter, more direct, and she took the side street behind the livery because it was shorter, and she was tired and not thinking about angles, and he came around the corner of the livery fence from the other direction, and there he was. They were alone. She stopped walking. He stopped too, maybe 8 feet away, and he smiled. That smile, the exact same one she had been seeing in her nightmares for 2 years, the one that meant I have already won, and I am giving you the chance to understand that before I have to demonstrate it. Elara, he said, just her name, warm, like they were family. Roderick, she said. You look well, he said, with the concern of someone who meant the opposite. Thank you, she said. I've been hoping we could talk, he said, taking a small step toward her that was not quite threatening and was not quite not. Just the two of us. Without all the, he gestured vaguely at the town around them, the audience. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. Her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be, but it was there, it was words. He tilted his head. I don't want to fight, Elara. I never wanted to fight. You know that. She looked at him. At that face, she had spent years watching across dining tables and in courthouse hallways, and at her husband's graveside, this face that she had once been afraid to look directly at, because looking directly at it meant acknowledging what was underneath it. "What you want," she said carefully, "is the same thing you've always wanted." And the answer is still no. Something moved in his expression. The warmth cooled by 1 degree, just one, almost imperceptible. "Those documents belong to the estate," he said, and his voice had shifted too, still gentle on the surface but denser underneath. "They belong to me," she said, "and I have proof of that." "You have letters," he said, "old letters. A judge is going to look at a formal signed agreement and letters from a grieving widow, and he's going to make a reasonable decision about which one carries more legal weight." "Then let him make it," she said. "I'm not afraid of a judge, Roderick. I'm afraid of you in a room where there's no judge." He stared at her, and there it was. The thing that happened when you said the true thing out loud to someone who had spent years counting on you not to say it. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted, something that had been patient, because it had been so confident it could afford to wait. "You've become very bold," he said. His voice was quieter now. "I've become something," she said. He studied her for a moment. "Town doesn't know you," he said. "I've been here 8 days, and I've had supper with the most important man in the county, drinks with the sheriff, and conversation with every business owner on this street. You've been here 2 months, and most people still don't know your name." He paused. "When a judge comes to town and has to decide who to believe, which one of us do you think this town is going to back?" It was a good argument. She knew it was a good argument because she'd been lying awake, making the same argument against herself every night for 8 days. But she thought about Martha Caldwell and the blue cloth. She thought about Sheriff Crane saying, "You spoke well." She thought about Corinne Vale standing in front of the bench saying, "I am not your enemy," in the only language Corinne knew how to use. She thought about Silas, who had known nothing about her and put a bench in the Morning Sun anyway. "You might be surprised," she said. Roderick looked at her for a long moment. "Elara," he said, and the warmth was entirely gone from his voice, now replaced with the flat certainty of a man who has decided to stop being polite because polite has stopped working. "Don't do this. You are a woman alone in a town where you have no standing and no history, and no one who owes you anything. I am offering you a way out that lets you keep your dignity. The alternative is a very public and very uncomfortable process where everything about your years with Thomas gets examined by people you've never met." He let that sit. "Think carefully." She looked at him. She felt the old fear. Of course she felt it. It was right there, where it always was, coiled up behind her sternum, the thing that had learned to live there during the years when fear was the most rational response to everything around her. But she also felt something else. Something that had been growing slowly in the weeks on that bench, something made from thin morning air and cold coffee, and the steady sound of a hammer and a cat with a dead bird and blue curtain fabric, and an aunt who poured her coffee first. "I have thought carefully," she said, "for 2 years, and my answer is no." He stared at her. She turned and walked away. Her legs were shaking. She could feel them shaking with every step, and she kept walking anyway, kept her back straight, kept moving, and she went all the way to the front of Lenora's, and up the front step and in through the door, and she stood in the front hallway with the door closed behind her and pressed both palms flat against it. Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her ears. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, and she put her face in her hands and let herself shake for a minute, just 1 minute, because she had earned it. She had stood in front of Roderick Whitcomb alone, with no witnesses and no plan and no one at her back, and she had said no. He was going to come at her harder now. She knew that. She had taken away the path that required her cooperation, and he would look for the path that didn't, and he would find one. And in 3 days, she needed to still be standing when Judge Calloway rode into town. She knew all of that. But she sat on the floor in the hallway and let herself have the 1 minute first. Then she got up. She went upstairs to her room. She retrieved the tin box from under the board and opened it and sat on the bed and went through the letters one by one, reading them slowly and carefully, reminding herself what was in them, what each one proved, and how, building the case in her mind the way you'd build something from timber, piece by piece, checking each joint. She was still reading when Lenora knocked and said supper was ready. "I'll be right down," Elara said, and her voice came out clear. Put the letters back, locked the box, tucked it under the board. 3 days. She could do 3 days. She was already doing it. She didn't sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. The nights before Roderick had arrived, she'd lain awake in the grip of anticipation, that specific dread that comes from knowing something bad is approaching and being unable to stop it. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of someone who has already taken the step and is now dealing with the ground on the other side of it, whatever that ground turns out to be. She had told him no, out loud, to his face, alone with no one watching. She turned on her side and looked at the window and listened to the town settle into its late-night quiet, and thought about the way his expression had changed in that alley behind the livery, the warmth going out of it degree by degree. She had seen that change before, in Missouri, in rooms where she'd been the only other person, and in those days that change had preceded things she didn't think about directly anymore, if she could help it. But here, in that alley, she had walked away, and he had let her walk away. Not because he was done. She was under no illusions about that. But because they were in a public town, where the sheriff had already come calling, and the circuit judge was 3 days out, and because Roderick Whitcomb was, above all else, a man who understood the value of appearances. He would not grab a woman in a public alley. He would not raise his voice where anyone could hear. What he would do was work harder. She got up at 4:30, not because she heard anything alarming, but because lying down had stopped serving any purpose, and she sat in the dark of her room and thought through the next 3 days with the careful deliberateness of someone making a plan with very few materials. She had the letters. She had Silas's knowledge of the circuit schedule. She had Lenora. She had Corinne, maybe, in whatever capacity Corinne was willing to offer. She had Martha Caldwell, who had no stake in any of it, but who had talked to her about curtains and seemed like a woman who formed her opinions independently. She had Sheriff Crane, who had not committed to anything, but who had looked at her and listened to her and not dismissed what he'd seen. And she had sent a letter to Beaumont 9 days ago. She did not know if Beaumont had written back. She did not know if there had been time for a letter to travel to Caldwell and for a response to make the return. She told herself not to count on it. She told herself the case had to stand on its own, without outside support, because outside support was uncertain, and the letters were what she had, and the letters would have to be enough. She told herself that. She didn't entirely believe it, which was why she was sitting in the dark at 4:30 in the morning thinking in circles. When the sky began lightening, she got dressed, retrieved the tin box, unlocked it, and counted the letters once more. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed. And she read them not as evidence, but as correspondence as what they actually were, which was words she had written in rooms where she'd had to choose each one carefully, and words that had been written to her before Thomas died, before the will was read, before Roderick had produced that supposed agreement and smiled at her across a lawyer's desk. She read them as the record of a life that had actually happened, and when she was done, she sat with them in her lap for a while and felt, of all unexpected things, less afraid. Not unafraid, less afraid. There was a difference. She was on the bench before the sun was fully up, earlier than she'd ever been, so early that even Silas wasn't yet at the forge. She sat with her coffee cup empty because the pot wasn't set out yet and she hadn't thought to bring anything, and she didn't care. The air was cool and the main street was empty, and she sat there in the half-dark and let herself have the quiet before it became a day she had to be strong in. Silas appeared in the forge entrance maybe 20 minutes later. He stopped when he saw her, registered the empty cup, went back inside without comment, and came back out 2 minutes later with the pot. He filled her cup. He didn't say anything about her being there so early. He got the fire going and picked up his hammer and started the day. After maybe half an hour, he said, without turning. "What time did you get up?" 4:30, she said. The hammer paused. "Did something happen?" "He found me alone yesterday," she said, behind the livery. The hammer was still. She heard him. "Set it down." He came to the entrance and looked at her with an expression that was controlled in the way of someone who has decided to be controlled about something. What did he say? He asked. She told him. The whole thing, as close to verbatim as she could get. Silas had asked, and because she had learned that there was a difference between keeping information private because you chose to and keeping it private because you'd been taught that sharing it was weakness. Roderick had taught her that. She was unlearning it. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You walked away, he said. Yes. Good, he said. And then he's going to move faster now. I know. 2 days, he said. Judge Calloway comes day after tomorrow, she said. If he's on schedule, he usually is, Silas said. He values his schedule. It's about the only thing between him and chaos on a circuit this long. She turned her cup in her hands. I need to file a formal request to present before him. Before Roderick does. Crane can help you with that, Silas said. He handles the preliminary paperwork when Calloway comes through. If you go to him today, this morning, and file the request yourself, it goes in the log before anything Roderick submits. She hadn't known that. She looked up at him. How do you know that? Hatch, he said. It was almost an answer to everything in Ironwood Crossing. Old Hatch. He's been here 30 years, knows every procedural detail about the circuit court because he's had 3 property disputes go through it. He looked at her. Go see Crane this morning. Early, before the sheriff's office gets busy. She nodded. Then, will you come with me? It came out before she'd quite decided to say it. She heard herself say it and felt the old embarrassment rising, the one that said you are asking too much. You are becoming a burden. You should not need someone to walk a block with you, like a child, and she pushed it down. Hard. Silas looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said simply, and picked up his hammer again. They went to Crane's office at 8 o'clock, when the street was just starting to come alive with the morning's business. Silas walked beside her. Not in front of her, not close enough to suggest he was guiding her anywhere, just alongside at her pace. Crane was already at his desk when they came in. He looked at them both, registered something, and said nothing about Silas being there. Miss Whitcomb, he said, I'd like to file a formal petition to present before Judge Calloway, she said, for the day after tomorrow. Crane opened the logbook on his desk without ceremony. What's the nature of the petition? Disputed inheritance, she said. I have correspondence and documentation establishing that a property agreement produced by Roderick Whitcomb, who is currently in this town, is fraudulent. I intend to present the original documents before the judge. Crane wrote this down. His handwriting was neat and slow. He read back what he'd written, asked her to confirm the spelling of her name, wrote in the date and time of receipt. You're aware that Mr. Whitcomb has also indicated. He may appear before the judge, Crane said. I am, she said. That's his right, it is, Crane agreed. He closed the logbook. Calloway tends to hear both parties on the same day when cases are related. You'd need to be prepared to present your case and respond to his. I'm prepared, she said. Crane looked at her, the same look he'd given her before, careful, forming something. He's been asking around, he said. Whitcomb, asking people to speak to his character. I know, she said. Martin Vale had some words with me yesterday, he said. She kept her face still. And, she asked. Crane's expression shifted slightly. I told him that character witnesses are at the judge's discretion, and that my job is to make sure both parties get a fair hearing, not to determine in advance who's more trustworthy. He paused. I also told him that a man who sends an inquiry agent ahead of himself and works the town for over a week before showing his hand is a man who's thinking a lot about impressions, and that tends to make me curious about why. Elara looked at him. That's all, he said, and opened another folder on his desk, signaling the meeting was done. Thanked him, and they left. On the street outside, Silas said nothing. She said nothing. They walked back toward the forge and the boarding house in the morning air, and after half a block, she let out a long breath. Crane's fair, Silas said. Yes, she said. He's not on your side, he added, because he was the kind of person who didn't let useful information become more than it was. But he's fair. That matters. It does, she agreed. The letter from Beaumont arrived that afternoon. Lenora came upstairs with it herself, knocked twice, held it out when Elara opened the door. The envelope was travel-worn, the corners bent. Addressed in a neat hand, Elara recognized from the documents Beaumont had helped her copy 2 years ago. She took it into her room, sat on the bed, opened it carefully. 2 pages. She read them twice. Margaret Beaumont had received her first letter. She had, as it turned out, expected something like this. She had kept notes from her own consultation with Elara, including copies of the documents she'd helped compile. She was not able to travel to Ironwood Crossing in the time available, but she had drafted an affidavit attached, 3 pages, notarized attesting to the authenticity of the copies she had reviewed and to her professional assessment of the discrepancy in those documents and the property agreement Roderick had produced. She had also included one additional piece of information, which she said she had hesitated over before deciding Elara had a right to know. Elara read that part a third time. Roderick had approached Beaumont 6 months ago. He'd come to her office in Caldwell under a different pretext, asking about her practice, and had, somewhere in the conversation, mentioned the Whitcomb estate matter and suggested that any documentation she had relating to it would be better surrendered to the estate's legal representation. He had been polite. He had been persistent. Beaumont had told him she would review her files and be in touch. She had not been in touch. She had sent him a formal letter the following week, informing him that she had no relevant documentation and wished him good day. But she had understood what it meant. It meant Roderick knew about Beaumont. It meant he had been attempting to close the exits systematically and carefully for 6 months before coming to Ironwood Crossing himself. He had not expected to fail at Beaumont. He was not the kind of man who expected to fail at anything. But he had, and Beaumont had spent those 6 months keeping her notes and waiting to see if Elara would eventually need them. Elara sat on the bed with those 3 notarized pages in her hands and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite the breaking of something, but was perhaps the softening of it. Someone had kept the notes. Someone had waited, without being asked, just in case. She folded everything carefully and put it in the tin box with the letters, and this time, when she locked it, she thought about it differently. Not as the last thing she had left, as a case, as enough. She went to the bench that evening after supper, later than usual, when the day had gone to its last pink light and the street was quieter. Silas was finishing up, banking the forge for the night, and he came out and sat beside her on the bench with his own cup. And they sat there in companionable silence for a while in the way they had gotten used to. 2 people who had both learned somewhere along the way that silence between people who trusted each other was not an absence of something, but a presence of it. "I heard back from Beaumont," she said. He looked at her. She told him what was in the letter. All of it, including Roderick's visit to Beaumont's office 6 months ago. She watched his face as she told him, watched the controlled stillness of it, and the thing moving underneath that stillness that she had come to recognize as the particular anger of a man who keeps his anger in a closed room, but knows exactly where the room is. "He's been working at this for 6 months, Silas said. "Not a question," at least she said. "Probably longer. He spent 2 years trying to get me to hand the documents over without a hearing. When I ran, he found another way, and he still doesn't know exactly what you have," Silas said. "He knows I have letters. He doesn't know about Beaumont's affidavit. He doesn't know I have the letter he wrote to his own lawyer. The week after Thomas's funeral, the one that contradicts his timeline by 3 months." She paused. "He thinks he's ahead of me." Silas considered that. "Let him think it," he said. "Until tomorrow." She looked at him. "Do you think Calloway will hear it fairly?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Think Calloway is an old man who has been on a circuit court for 20 years and has seen every version of someone trying to claim what isn't theirs, and I think he can smell the shape of a situation before the papers are produced." He paused. "I also think that a woman showing up to his court with original correspondence, authenticated copies, and a notarized affidavit from a lawyer who was approached and didn't cooperate is going to make a certain kind of impression." She looked at the street, at the hotel at the far end, where Roderick was presumably spending his 9th evening, in town, feeling very confident about the next day. "He's going to say things about me," she said, "in court. Things about my state of mind, about grief, about confusion." She had been turning this over for days, the way you turn something sharp over in your hands, knowing it will cut you, but needing to know exactly where the edge is. "He's going to make me sound like a woman who doesn't understand what she signed. And you're going to show the judge what you actually signed," Silas said, "and what you didn't. It's not always enough," she said. "Evidence isn't always enough." A judge looks at the whole picture, and sometimes the picture is, she stopped. Sometimes a woman who can barely get through a sentence without her voice shaking doesn't make the best impression standing next to a man who owns every room he walks into. Silas looked at her. Your voice doesn't shake, he said. Not anymore. She thought about that. She thought about the bench outside the general store, the 11 minutes she'd stood there unable to go in. She thought about the 2 words, thank you, that had come out of her like something dragged up from very far down. She thought about Martha Caldwell and the blue cloth, and getting there, it's a good town. She thought about the alley behind the livery, and the answer is still no. Still shake sometimes, she said. Yes, he said. But you talk anyway. She turned that over. Why did you put the bench out? She asked. She had wanted to ask it for weeks. It had been forming in her ever since. The morning she'd asked him why he'd helped her, and he'd said next time, and she hadn't pushed because pushing felt rude, and then more time had passed, and asking felt like it had passed its window. But they were sitting here the night before the day that might determine the next 10 years of her life, and she found it run she'd have patience with her own hesitance. Silas was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. There was someone, he said finally, years ago, my sister. She went through something that he stopped, moved something around in his expression, and started again. Scree. People around her kept trying to get her to talk about it, kept asking questions and offering to listen and making it clear they were waiting for her to explain herself. And she got quieter every time. He looked at his cup. I watched that, and I thought about it for a long time afterward. About how, when a door's stuck, pushing harder from the same direction doesn't open it. Elara was quiet. She's all right now, he said. Took a long time. But she is. Did she find her way back? Elara asked. To herself? Mostly, he said, not all the way. Some things you don't come all the way back from. But enough. He looked at the street. Enough to live. She held that for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. About your sister. She doesn't need sorry, he said. She's fine. I know, she said. I'm sorry anyway. For you. For the watching of it. He looked at her then. A direct look that he gave rarely, and that always, when it came, felt like being taken seriously in a very specific way. You're going to be all right tomorrow, he said. You don't know that, she said. No, he agreed. But I think you are. She looked at the last of the light going out of the sky over the western end of the street. I think I might be, she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. The morning of the circuit court arrived, with a sky that couldn't make up its mind, cloud-streaked and changeable, and the main street of Ironwood Crossing had a different quality to it, a kind of braced awareness, the way a town gets when something is happening that the whole town knows about, even if only a few people are directly involved. People knew. Of course they knew. Roderick had spent 9 days making sure they knew, not the version Elara would have told, but his version. The version where he was a reasonable man trying to resolve a family matter, and the widow was the difficult variable. She had spent the last 10 days not hiding, not running, going to the store and the post office in the street and saying good morning and nice day. And that's a good bolt of cloth until those things came without having to think through them first. She did not know if it had been enough. She was going to find out. She was on the bench by 6:30. She had dressed carefully, not in the way of trying to look like something she wasn't, but in the way of a woman who understood that appearances carried weight and had decided to take that seriously. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly. She wore her best dress, gray-blue wool that had traveled well, and her posture was straight in the way she'd been making it straight for days. Not stiff but upright, the posture of someone who was present and intended to remain so. She had the tin box in her room. She would retrieve it when it was time. She did not carry it with her to the bench because she did not want to arrive at the courthouse holding on to it, like it was a life raft. She wanted to arrive holding on to herself. Silas came out of the forge at 7 and looked at her and said nothing except, "Coffee? Please," she said. He poured it and went back to work, and the hammer started, and she sat in the morning air and breathed and let the rhythm of it settle her, the way it always did. The most dependable sound she had found since arriving in this town. The thing that had been there before she knew she needed it and had kept being there long after. At 8 o'clock, Lenora came out of the boarding house and crossed the street, and Sam sat beside her on the bench, which she had never done before. She was dressed for the day. Apron off, hair pinned, and she sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the street. "You sleep?" she asked. "Some," Elara said. "Eat?" "I'll eat after." Lenora nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your mother, the last time I saw her, told me she had made a lot of choices in her life that had more to do with what she was afraid of than what she wanted." She paused. She said the only one she didn't regret was the one she made out of wanting, even though it was the hardest one. Lenora turned to look at her. "Think about that a lot." "I thought you should know," she said it. Elara looked at her aunt. "What was the choice?" she asked. "Leaving your father," Lenora said simply. Coming back to herself first. The morning air between them was still. "Thank you," Elara said. Lenora patted her hand once, briefly, businesslike. Then she stood and straightened her skirt. "I'll be in the hall when you're ready to go." She went back across the street. The hammer had stopped at some point without Elara noticing, and Silas was standing in the entrance to the forge. He had washed and changed into a clean shirt, which struck her suddenly. The deliberateness of that, the quiet statement of it. "You're coming," she said. "If that's all right," he said. She thought of what he'd told her the night before, about not standing in front of her, about there being a difference between supporting someone and replacing them. "Yes," she said, "but you don't speak for me," he said. "And if I lose," she started. "Then we figure out what's next," he said. "But you're not going to lose." She stood up from the bench. She set the empty cup down. "I'll get the tin box," she said. She crossed the street and went upstairs and retrieved it from under the board and held it for one moment in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the 2 years of carrying it, the 4 years before that of not yet having it. Tucked it under her arm. She went downstairs. Lenora was in the hall. Through the window she could see Silas waiting on the step. Corinne Vale was standing on the boardwalk across the street. Elara stopped. Corinne looked at her through the window for a moment, then nodded. Not a wave, not a smile, just a nod, the kind between people who have come to a certain understanding. And then she turned and walked in the direction of the town hall, where Judge Calloway would be setting up his court. Elara came out the front door. She stood for one moment on the step in the changeable morning light. She thought of Roderick's face in the alley, the warmth cooling degree by degree, and she thought of her own voice saying, "The answer is still no," and she thought of how that voice had not been the loud voice, not the confident voice, not the voice of someone who had never been afraid. It had been her voice, shaking slightly, saying the true thing anyway. She went down the step and walked toward the town hall. Lenora on one side, Silas on the other, Corinne Vale 100 feet ahead. The tin box under her arm, with all the proof she had of a life that had actually happened, a life that was hers, that no one had the right to erase or rewrite or take away with a forged signature, and a room full of people who hadn't been there to see the truth of it. The door of the town hall was open. She walked through it. The town hall of Ironwood Crossing was not built for ceremony. Planktangular room with plank floors and 2 rows of bench seating that were used for town meetings, the occasional wedding reception when the church was occupied, and 4 times a year for the circuit court of Judge Emmett Calloway. The walls were bare except for a territorial map on one side and a notice board on the other. The windows were tall, but the glass was old and wavy, so the light that came through had a slightly distorted quality, like looking at the world through water. Elara came through the door and stopped for just a moment to get her bearings. The room was fuller than she'd expected. She didn't know why she'd expected it to be empty. Of course it wouldn't be empty. Ironwood Crossing had been primed for this. Roderick had been priming it for 9 days. She saw Martha Caldwell near the back, and Boyd Hatch from the Silver Horn, and 2 women she recognized from the milliners. She saw Martin Vale seated near the front, which made her stomach tighten, and then she saw Corinne sitting 3 rows behind her father, which made it loosen slightly. She saw Harlan Voss standing against the side wall, which she had half expected, and she looked at him for just long enough to let him know she'd seen him, and then she looked away. She did not see Roderick yet. She moved to the petitioner's side of the room, the left-hand side as you entered, and sat down in the front row. Lenora sat beside her. Silas sat on Lenora's other side, giving Elara the seat closest to the judge's table, which was simply a larger table than the others, with a gavel on it and a water pitcher that nobody had filled. She set the tin box on the bench beside her. She folded her hands in her lap. She had been in courtrooms before. The one in Missouri, twice, where she had sat in the back row and said nothing, and watched Roderick produce his documents, and watched lawyers nod, and watched the proceedings arrange themselves around the shape of his story, like water, finding the lowest point. She had not spoken in those proceedings. She had not been asked to speak. She had been, as Roderick had long arranged, the widow in the background, the grief-softened variable, the human detail in what he'd successfully framed as a paperwork matter. This time she had filed the petition herself. This time her name was in Crane's logbook first. It was not nothing. The door opened on the right side, and Roderick came in. He was dressed well, as always dark coat, clean shirt, hat in hand, the way a man holds his hat when he wants to look respectful. He came in with two other men she didn't recognize, lawyers probably, and he moved to the right side of the room with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before and found it agreeable. He looked at her as he sat down. She looked back. She held the look for 3 full seconds before she turned her attention to the judge's table. She didn't know if he'd seen what she was doing. She did it anyway. Judge Emmett Calloway came in from the back room, exactly on time, which Silas had said he always did. He was older than she'd pictured from Silas's description, maybe 65, with a trimmed white beard and the kind of unhurried deliberateness that came from having made decisions for a very long time and having made enough wrong ones to become careful about the process rather than impatient with it. He sat down, adjusted his papers, looked at the room with mild interest, and said, "We'll begin with the petition filed by Miss Elara Whitcomb regarding a disputed inheritance matter. Miss Whitcomb, are you present?" "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice carried. She felt Lenora's slight shift beside her. Not movement exactly. More the quality of someone registering something that pleased them. "Mr. Roderick Whitcomb, are you present and intending to respond?" "Yes, Your Honor," Roderick said from across the room, with precisely the right amount of deference and self-assurance. Calloway looked at both of them. "All right, we'll hear the petitioner first. Whitcomb, you have the floor." She stood up. She had thought about this moment for 11 days. She had rehearsed it in her room and on the bench and in the quiet hours before dawn. She had written out what she wanted to say and then thrown the paper away because she knew that reading from paper would make her sound managed rather than truthful, and truthful was the only thing she actually had going for her that Roderick didn't. She picked up the tin box. She set it on the table in front of Calloway. "Your Honor," she said, "my late husband Thomas Whitcomb died in September of 1879. At the reading of his will, Roderick Whitcomb, Thomas's brother, produced a document he claimed was a property agreement, signed by me, transferring my portion of the Whitcomb estate to the family trust." She kept her voice even. "I never signed that document. I never saw it until the day it was produced. And I have original correspondence that establishes both what I did agree to before Thomas died and what the condition of the estate was at the time, correspondence that directly contradicts the timeline Roderick has presented." She began laying the letters on the table in the order she'd decided on. Not all of them at once, one by one with a brief explanation of each. The room was quiet. She had expected the quiet to unsettle her. Instead, it helped. She was used to quiet. She had lived inside it for years, and she knew the difference between the quiet of a room ignoring someone and the quiet of a room paying attention. This room was paying attention. She presented 7 letters in sequence, presented the deed record. She presented the copy of Beaumont's notes, and then, last, she set the notarized affidavit on top of the pile. "This is a notarized affidavit from Margaret Beaumont, a practicing lawyer in Caldwell, who reviewed the original documents I carried with me when I left Missouri. She attests to their authenticity and to the discrepancy in dates between the timeline Roderick has presented and the timeline the correspondence establishes." She paused. She also notes that she was contacted by Roderick Whitcomb 6 months ago and asked to surrender any documentation related to this matter. She declined and informed him in writing that she had no relevant materials. She heard something move in the room, not a sound exactly, but a quality, the shift of people who have just received a piece of information that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. I have that letter as well, she said. If the court wishes to see it. Calloway was already reading the affidavit. He read slowly, with the same unhurried deliberateness he'd brought to everything. And the room waited, and Elara stood at the table with her hands loose at her sides and breathed. "Thank you." "Miss Whitcomb," Calloway said, without looking up. "You may sit, Mr. Whitcomb." Roderick stood with the ease of long practice. She had told herself she was ready for this part. She told herself she knew what he was going to say, and how he was going to say it, and that knowing it in advance was an advantage. Both of those things were true. It was still hard to sit and listen to him. Good. She could not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. He was measured and warm, and he expressed concern for Elara. In the same breath, he questioned her reliability. The way you can hand someone something sharp while smiling and have them unsure for a moment whether they've been given a gift or cut. He spoke about Thomas with what sounded like genuine grief. Spoke about the responsibility of the estate and the obligations of the family and the painful position he had been put in when certain documents had gone missing after Thomas's death. Missing, not taken. Missing. Elara pressed her thumbnail into her palm. He produced his copy of the property agreement, 2 pages, dated 6 months before Thomas died, signed, or appearing to be signed, by both Thomas and Elara. The notary seal was from a firm in Jefferson City. He placed it before Calloway with the quiet confidence of a man, placing his winning card. "Your Honor," he said, "I have nothing but sympathy for my sister-in-law. She endured a great deal during Thomas's illness, and his death was a blow to her. The agreement before you is legal and duly executed, and the documents she has presented, while heartfelt, are personal correspondence, private letters." He let that word sit. Not legal instruments, not executed agreements, letters. He spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man being very patient with an unreasonable situation. She is grieving. She has perhaps convinced herself that what she remembers is what happened. But the law is not concerned with what we remember. It is concerned with what we can demonstrate. He sat down. The room breathed. Calloway looked at the agreement. He looked at the letters. He looked at Beaumont's affidavit. He was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "the agreement before me is dated March of 1879. "Yes, Your Honor." "You'll note that Miss Whitcomb's correspondence includes a letter dated May of 1879, written by your attorney to your brother, discussing the structure of the estate." He tapped the letter in question. "In that letter, your attorney writes that the property distribution will be handled according to Thomas Whitcomb's existing will, with no modifications currently agreed upon." He paused. "That letter postdates your agreement by 2 months. If the agreement had been signed in March, your own attorney was unaware of it in May." Silence. The particular kind of silence that arrives when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Roderick's expression did not change on the surface. But she'd been watching his face for years, and she saw it the microscopic tightening around his eyes, the one that happened when the path he'd prepared for met something he hadn't accounted for. Correspondence between attorneys can be, he started. "I'm not finished," Calloway said, not unkindly, but without any room in it. Roderick closed his mouth. "The notary seal on this agreement," Calloway continued, "is from Hargrove and Sons, Jefferson City. I am familiar with that firm." He looked at Roderick over the paper. "They closed in January of 1879, 2 months before this document is dated." The room went very still. Elara felt it happen, the full, absolute stillness that fills a space when something has been exposed that everyone present now understands at the same moment. She felt it in the room, the way you feel a change in air pressure, sudden and total. She did not look at Roderick. She looked at Calloway. "The seal is a forgery," Calloway said. He said it plainly, without drama, with the flat clarity of someone stating a fact he has confirmed and intends to record. No document from this firm could have been executed in March of 1879 because the firm did not exist in March of 1879. The room, which had been still, now moved. Not loudly, there was no uproar, no shouting. Quality of the silence broke apart into the small sounds of people turning to each other, the rustle of coats, a murmur near the back that Crane, standing at the side wall, let go for 3 seconds before he said once, order, and it stopped. Elara sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Calloway asked Roderick to respond. Roderick stood. He was still composed. She had to give him that. He had lived his entire life inside composure, and he didn't abandon it now, which in another context might have been something to respect. Your Honor, he said, I was not aware of any issue with the notary. I received that document from my brother's attorneys, and I presented it in good faith. There is a problem with the seal. I would suggest that speaks to the firm's record-keeping rather than... The firm was closed, Calloway said. Their records are archived with the territorial court. I will verify, but I am confident in what I know about Hargrove and Sons. He looked at Roderick steadily. Do you have any other documentation to support your claim to the estate? Pause. I would need time to gather. You have had 2 years, Calloway said, and you have had 9 days in this town. He looked at his papers. You came here with 1 document. It appears to be fraudulent. Miss Whitcomb came here with 7 letters. A deed record, an authenticated set of copies, and a notarized affidavit from a lawyer you attempted to pressure 6 months ago. He set the property agreement to one side, a gesture so small and so final that it hit Elara behind the sternum like something physical. I don't require more time to form a view of this matter. He sat down slowly, and something in how he did it, the careful lowering of it, the control told her that the composure was costing him more than it looked like. Calloway made his ruling in less than 10 minutes. The property agreement was disqualified as evidence, based on the fraudulent notary seal. The estate distribution would revert to Thomas Whitcomb's original will, which left Elara her rightful portion. Court further noted that the affidavit from Beaumont would be submitted to the territorial court for review, in connection with the question of the document's origin, and that Roderick Whitcomb would be required to make himself available for further inquiry. Elara heard all of this and understood all of this, and sat in the front row of the Ironwood Crossing town hall, with her hands folded in her lap, and felt very distantly like something that had been wound extremely tight for an extremely long time was beginning, slowly and uncertainly, to loosen. People came to her afterward, not a flood of them, not a dramatic reversal where everyone who had doubted her now rushed to declare themselves her ally. It was more modest than that, and more real. Martha Caldwell touched her arm briefly on the way out and said, "Well done, Mr." Hatch, who had presumably been told by his nephew what had happened, nodded at her with the particular gravity of a man acknowledging that he'd gotten something wrong without wanting to discuss it extensively. Sheriff Crane said, "Congratulations. Miss Whitcomb," the straight-faced economy of someone for whom those 2 words were sufficient and appropriate. Corinne Vale came to her outside the town hall. She had clearly been waiting, standing to one side of the door in the morning air, with her arms crossed, and an expression Elara couldn't quite read until she was close enough to see that it was not what she'd expected. It was not satisfaction or vindication. It was something more complicated, something that looked, on Corinne's normally sharp-angled face, almost like relief. "My father is in there talking to Crane," Corinne said. "I think he's trying to figure out what he should have done differently." She paused. "He's not a bad man. He just believed what he was told." "I know," Elara said. She did know that it had always been Roderick's particular gift not finding bad people to recruit to his side, but finding good ones who were simply trusting enough to be useful. "I talked to him last night," Corinne said. "Told him what I'd noticed at supper. About Roderick never using your name." She looked at the door. "He didn't change his mind right away. He's stubborn." A wry note in her voice. "He's very stubborn, but I think it planted something." "It might have helped," Elara said. "I don't know." "It might have," Corinne agreed. She looked back at Elara. There was something she was working toward, something she hadn't quite gotten to yet, and Elara waited, because she had gotten reasonably good at waiting by now. "I misjudged you," Corinne said finally. "From the beginning. I decided what you were before I knew anything about you, and then I talked, and..." She stopped. "And I made it harder for you." "Yes," Elara said. "You did." Corinne held her gaze. She'd been expecting a softer answer, maybe, or at least a more diplomatic one. She didn't flinch from the direct one. "I'm sorry," she said. Elara looked at her for a moment. Corinne Vale was not someone she would have chosen as a friend. They were not built the same way. Corinne was loud where Elara was quiet, confident where Elara was careful. The kind of woman who took up a room naturally where Elara had spent years making herself smaller. But she had come to Elara's bench and told her the truth when she didn't have to. She had talked to her father. She had sat 3 rows behind him in that courtroom today in a way that was its own kind of statement. People were not simple. Elara had learned that the hard way, but she had learned it. "I know you are," she said. "Thank you. For talking to your father." Corinne nodded, the tight-chinned nod of someone absorbing something they needed to sit with. Then she said, "The blue cloth." Martha said, "You helped her pick it out." "I mentioned it had good weight," Elara said. "She bought 12 yards, Corinne said, and the corner of her mouth moved, made curtains for every window in her house. Elara felt something lighten in her chest. "That seems like a lot of curtains." "She's very thorough," Corinne said. They looked at each other for a moment, and it was not warm exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something honest, which was more than Elara had expected from this morning, or possibly from this town. Roderick left that afternoon. She did not see him go. She was back at Lenora's, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Lenora had made without being asked, when Silas came in through the back door and said, "His coach just pulled out." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Voss too?" she asked. "Voss left an hour ago," Silas said. "Rode out while Calloway was still talking to Crane." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. His attorney left on the same coach as Roderick. She nodded. She waited to feel something. She wasn't sure what triumph, maybe, or relief in the dramatic sense, the kind that came with tears or shaking or some visible release of all the pressure that had been building for 2 years and 9 days and several weeks before that. She waited for it, and what she felt instead was tiredness that went all the way to the bottom of her, the kind that isn't unpleasant, exactly, the kind that comes when you've been carrying something for a very long time and have finally been allowed to set it down. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would," she said. Silas looked at her. "What did you think it would feel like?" She thought about it. "Larger," she said. "I thought it would feel larger." "It will," he said. "Later, when it's had time to settle." She looked at him. "You sound like you know," she said. "I've had some things settle over time," he said. "The feeling comes after. It's not immediate." Lenora set a plate of bread and butter between them without comment and went back to the stove, and Silas helped himself to a piece, with the ease of a man who had been in this kitchen enough times to be comfortable, which made Elara realize, somewhat belatedly, that he had been here quite a few times over the weeks she'd been in residence, bringing things Lenora needed from the forge, fixing a hinge on the back door, occasionally accepting a cup of coffee on the back step. She had noticed it. She had not, until now, registered what it meant. She looked at the bread and looked at Silas and looked at her aunt's back. There was time for things to settle. 3 days after the hearing, a letter came from the territorial court in response to Calloway's submission. Elara was on the bench when Lenora brought it out to her. She opened it carefully, read it twice, then held it in her lap and looked at the main street of Ironwood Crossing for a while. The territorial court had opened a formal inquiry into the property agreement and its origin. Roderick Whitcomb had been notified and was required to appear. The process would take months, possibly longer. It was not over in the clean final sense she might have hoped for, but it was out of her hands now and into the hands of a process that had more power than she did. And the letters she had carried across 3 states in a tin box under a loose board were now filed with the territorial court as official evidence, rather than living under her washstand as the last card she had to play. She set the letter down on the bench beside her. Silas was at the forge. The hammer was going. She looked across the street at him, at the ordinary fact of him working on an ordinary morning, the same as every other morning, since the first time she'd picked up that second cup and sat down on this bench, because there was nowhere else she could breathe. "Good news?" he asked without turning. "Better than bad," she said. The hammer paused. "That's mostly how it works," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm starting to understand that." Cottonwoods turned gold in late September. Elara noticed them on a Tuesday the same way she had started noticing things again. Not with the hyper-vigilance she'd lived in for years, scanning everything for threat, but with the simple, unguarded attention of someone who is no longer spending all their noticing on survival. The trees along the creek at the east end of town went from green to gold over the course of about a week, and she saw it happening day by day from the bench and from the window of her room and from the road when she walked. She was walking more. She had started walking the town in the early evenings after supper, not because she had anywhere to go, but because she wanted to know the shape of it, the real shape, not the shape of a woman keeping to the edges in the early hours to avoid people she was afraid would think poorly of her. She walked down the main street and into the residential roads, on the north side and out along the creek bed when the weather was good, and people said good evening to her, and she said good evening back, and sometimes they talked for a little while, and sometimes they didn't, and both were fine. Martha Caldwell's east-facing windows did, in fact, have blue curtains now. Elara saw them one evening when she passed the house. She smiled at them, just to herself, just for a moment. She had taken on 2 small jobs by October. One was helping Lenora with the boarding house accounts, which Lenora had been doing longhand in a ledger that was harder to read every year as her eyesight declined. The other was copying correspondence for Mr. Hatch, who had more business than he'd had 10 years ago and whose handwriting was becoming as difficult as his ledger. Neither was much, but they were hers. She had found them herself and agreed to them herself and did them on her own terms, and that was different from anything she had done in the years of her marriage, when even the smallest decisions about her time had to move through Thomas first, and then, after Thomas, through the shadow Roderick cast over everything. She was not all right yet. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. There were still mornings she woke up in the grip of something that took several minutes to understand wasn't happening anymore. The old reflexes of a woman who had learned to read the temperature of a room before she entered it. There were still moments in conversation when her throat did the closing up thing, and she had to talk through it, which she could do now, but it wasn't gone, and she didn't know it would ever be entirely gone. She had decided that was something to work with, rather than something to wait, to get over. Silas about it one evening. Not about the throat closing, specifically, but about the larger question that had been forming in her for months, the one she kept approaching and then stepping back from, the way you step back from something hot. They were on the bench. The cottonwoods were gold. The air had the particular clarity of October in open country, the kind that made everything look slightly more defined than it usually did, like the world had come into better focus. "Do you think people actually change?" she asked. "Or do they just get better at managing who they already are?" Silas thought about it. He took his time, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he did not produce opinions quickly, that he turned them over, first to see all their sides. "Both, maybe," he said. "I think the shape of a person is pretty set. But what they do with the shape," he paused. "I think that can change." "That's not a very comforting answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "I think it's honest." She looked at the street. "I was like this before," she said, "before Thomas. Quiet, the difficulty with," she gestured at the world, generally. "With people, with rooms," she stopped. "I wasn't this bad. The shape was there." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because it's not a shape that gets made in a few years," he said. "It runs deeper than that." He was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't make what happened to you less of what it was. It just means the person who went into that marriage was already someone who struggled with certain things, and the marriage made them worse." He looked at her steadily, which is what people like Thomas and Roderick rely on. They find the places in people that are already a little bent, and they push on them. She sat with that for a long time. "I used to think," she said carefully, "that if I'd been stronger to start with, none of it would have happened." "That's what they want you to think," he said. "I know that now," she said. "But knowing it and feeling it are different things." "Yes," he said, "they are." The evening was going to dark around them, the gold of the trees holding the last of the light longer than everything else. She sat and looked at them and thought about the woman who had arrived in Ironwood Crossing in April, with one trunk and one battered tin box and a throat that sealed up every time she tried to be a person in the world. That woman was still here. She was sitting on this bench, but something was different. Something had been added, not replacing what was missing, but filling in alongside it, the way a tree grows around a wound, incorporating it into itself, becoming something that includes the scar. "I want to stay," she said. She hadn't planned to say it, but it was true, and it had been true for a while, and it seemed like a thing that should be said out loud to someone. Silas looked at her. "In Ironwood Crossing," she clarified, because saying it had felt like it might mean something else as well, and she wasn't ready to look at that directly. "I know what you meant," he said. She looked at her hands. "I know you did," she said. The bench was quiet for a minute. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. His voice had a quality she didn't recognize in it, something careful, the way careful sounds on someone who is not usually careful. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the street, his hands around his cup, and the evening light did something to the angles of his face that she noticed the way she had been noticing things lately, without trying to. "Not tonight," he said. "I want to ask you something, but not tonight. Tonight, I just wanted you to know I was going to." Stared at him. "That's an unusual way to do something," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been told I have an unusual way of doing most things." She sat for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Cottonwoods held their gold in the last of the light, and the street was quiet and familiar, and hers, in the way that places become yours when you have survived something in them, when you have sat in them shaking and come back the next morning anyway, and kept coming back until the shaking was something you did quietly and without stopping. She did not know what he was going to ask. She thought she might know. She sat on the bench that had been the first place in Ironwood Crossing where she could breathe, and she let herself not know for a little while longer. It was a thing she was learning, to let things come at their own pace. Stop bracing for what was next long enough to be in what was now. Slow learning. She was still very much in the middle of it. But she was in it. She was here. She had stayed. He asked her 2 weeks later. He came to Lenora's front door on a Sunday morning, which he had never done before, and he knocked, and Elara answered it herself and found him standing on the step with his hat in his hands, in the way she had never seen him hold his hat before. He was not a man who did things with his hat. He put it on and took it off, and that was the extent of it. Holding it in his hands was different. She looked at him. "You're doing the hat thing," she said. He looked down at it. "Yes. Is this the thing you were going to ask?" she said. "It's about to be," he said. She leaned against the door frame and waited, which felt like the right thing, since he had waited for her more times than she could count, and in more ways than she'd always recognized in the moment. Not elegantly, was not built for elegant speeches, and he didn't try for one, which was probably why it landed the way it did. He said that he had noticed her the morning she arrived, not because she was beautiful, or because she was mysterious, or any of the reasons people gave in stories, but because she stood in the middle of the main street, and nobody helped her with her trunk, and that had bothered him, for a reason he hadn't examined too closely at the time. The bench had been an impulse, and not a calculated gesture, and that for a while had thought it might have been a foolish one. He said that somewhere between the cat with the dead bird, and the morning she'd said, "Anther, the answer is still no," to a man in an alley, and then walked away without looking back. He'd understood something about the shape of her that he had not been able to stop thinking about since. He said he would like, if she was willing, to court her properly. And then he added, because he was Silas Mercer, and he always told the truth, even when it complicated things. "I know you've been someone else's property, and I know that word has a whole history in it for you. I'm not asking to own anything. I'm asking to be around, if you want that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had arrived in April unable to buy soap. She thought about Thomas and the rooms she'd gotten smaller in. She thought about the tin box and the letters and the notary seal from a firm that had closed before the document that bore it had supposedly been signed. She thought about how long she had believed that the quiet inside her was a flaw, and how slowly she was learning that it was just the shape of her, and that the right person for the shape of her was not someone who would fill it up, but someone who would sit beside it and let it be what it was. "I want that," she said. He nodded, in the way he nodded when something was understood between them. "Good," he said. She stood back from the door. "Come in for coffee," she said. Lenora made too much as usual. He came in. They married the following spring, on a Saturday in late April. 1 year and 2 weeks after a battered stagecoach had rattled into the main street and deposited a woman with one trunk and a locked tin box and a throat that sealed up when she tried to be a person in the world. The ceremony was at Lenora's, in the front parlor, which was the right size for the people who mattered, and too small for people who didn't. Lenora stood beside Elara. Martha Caldwell came with her husband. Crane came with his wife, several others. Corinne Vale stood near the back, which was where she'd put herself, not claiming a front row place she hadn't earned, but not staying away either, which was its own kind of honesty. She and Elara had spent the past month building that did not yet have a name and did not need one. They were not alike. They probably never would be. Corinne had chosen truth when it cost her something to choose it, and Elara had not forgotten that. And forgiveness, she's had learned, did not require you to pretend that the thing forgiven had not happened. They walked out to the bench, just the two of them. April air was still cool in the mornings, the same clear spring light that had been there the morning she'd first sat down with her empty cup. The forge was cold. Silas had told his apprentice to manage it for the day, but the bench was exactly where it had always been, the wood worn smooth in the places where she'd pressed her hands down and breathed. She sat on it. He sat beside her. Didn't say anything for a while, which was right, because they were people who had built something real in the silence between them, something that didn't need to be explained or announced. She thought about the woman who had sat here for the first time, both hands around a tin cup that had been left out for her by someone who asked nothing in return, in a strange town where nobody knew her, and she couldn't buy soap without rehearsing it, and the weight of everything she was carrying was so constant she'd stopped being able to feel it because it was just her life. She thought about what Lenora had told her that her mother said, the only choice she didn't regret being the one made out of wanting rather than fear. This was the first choice Elara had made purely out of wanting in longer than she could precisely remember. It did not feel the way choices felt in stories. It didn't feel like an ending or a beginning or a revelation. It felt like a morning, ordinary and cool, and full of the specific sound of a town that was going about its business around her without requiring her to perform anything. The forge would start tomorrow. The hammer would go. She would be on the bench with her coffee, the same as every other morning, except that now everything was different in the way that things are different when they are exactly the same, but you are not. She pressed her hand flat on the worn wood of the bench. It had been the first solid thing she'd found in Ironwood Crossing. Still here. So was she. That was the whole story. That was the entire thing. A woman who could not speak, finding the place where the silence was safe enough to begin from. And then, word by word, in the halting and imperfect, and sometimes shaking way of someone who had forgotten what her own voice was for, learning to use it again. Not loudly, not all at once, not without cost, but hers. Always hers. And nobody, not now, not ever again, was going to take that away.